Well, thank you, Matthias. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to share with you all some ideas and some reflections on my most recent paper, Technological Revolution, Democratic Recession, and Climate Change, The Limits of Law in a Changing World. The origin of this paper is that I was invited to be the keynote speaker at the opening of the annual conference of the International Society of Public Law last July in Santiago de Chile, and I tried to figure a subject that could be interesting from people that would be coming from different parts of the world, people from the United States, from Korea, from Colombia, from Germany, from Taiwan. So I thought this subject could be attractive, or at least one of them could be attractive to people that were attending the event. And I divided the presentation into 3 parts. And let me tell you, I'm not used to PowerPoints. I think this is the first time I'm working with PowerPoint, so please be gentle and patient with me. I'm a beginner. So I divided it in 3 parts. Part 1 is a few lessons from the 20th century. Part 2, transformations and afflictions of the 21st century. And Part 3, the challenges of our time, limits and possibilities of the law. I won't be talking much about law, but just for you to know, I'm a lawyer for training, and that's perspective I usually take when looking at life. So here we go, part 1, a few lessons from the 20th century. And I start by saying that 2 dystopias marked the 20th century literature. The first one was Brave New World, written by Aldous Huxley, published in 1932, a moment of a great optimism regarding the potential of science. And the book tells a story in which the advance of biotechnology creates a hedonistic paradise, or an apparent hedonistic paradise, that in fact concealed a dehumanized and authoritarian society. The second dystopia that marked literature of the 20th century was 1984, published in 1949, written by George Orwell, at a time in which the world watched the growing power of Soviet Union and the political appeal of communism. And Orwell describes the frightening and depressing reality of a totalitarian state sustained by oppressive social control of citizens with censorship, surveillance, propaganda, and brutal repression. Fortunately, neither of those 2 dystopias occurred, but they bring important warnings from the 20th century about the risks of the combination of politics, authoritarianism, technology, and genetic engineering. The truth, however, is that democracy was the victorious ideology of the 20th century, and it has defeated all the alternative projects that disputed with it, namely communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and Islamic fundamentalism. And that led a famous political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, to write his famous article and then book, The End of History, in which he thought that liberal democracy had won, had been the ideological culmination of ideology, and that history had ended. Just to finish this first topic, I should say that the dystopias were not consummated. Democracy did win the battle in the 20th century, but history did not come to an end. I didn't mention this. I divided the talk in 3 parts, and each part is divided in 3 topics. I have an obsession for classifying things in 3 categories. You'll notice that as I talk. The second topic in the first part is the world has improved significantly. And still concerning the 20th century, it was an age of extremes, as written by the famous historian Eric Hobsbawm. Extremes because we had the great wars and we had genocides, but it was also the century that consecrated human rights and democracy. And in the paper and here, I tried to demonstrate, and I think it's fairly easy, that humanity ended the 20th century much better off than it had started. And then I used a amount of comforting data that you, if you're pessimistic, you can find in an important book by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now, in which he shows that we live more and better in a planet with fewer wars, less malnutrition and poverty, greater access to knowledge, and more rights, including to groups that had been historically discriminated, like women, blacks, and gays. So I added this topic just to demonstrate that there's no point in the feeling that the world is in decline, about to fall into the chaotic realm of misery, wars, revolution, terrorism, drug trafficking, as well as all kinds of intolerance and epidemics. It's good sometimes to throw an optimistic view on things. And the third and last part of this first chapter is the critical importance of institutions. And here is something I would like to stress. Probably the most, or one of the most important lessons we learned from the 20th century was the crucial importance of institutions. Countries that viewed truly economic and political inclusive institutions achieve prosperity. Countries in which political and economic institutions are appropriated by extractive elites are doomed to poverty, or at best to middle income level. And then I show that the political and economic literature documents this finding, contrasting very interesting experiences like Spain and England in the 17th century, and the United States and Latin America in the 18th century. And this important book by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, in this book by Nations Fail, they try to demonstrate, and I think they do it very properly, that the causes of prosperity and poverty are not associated mostly with geography, culture, or ignorance of what is the right thing to do. According to them, it's the way that institutions distribute economic and political power in society that makes the real difference. And then he uses this emblematic example of Nogales. It's a city that is at the border of the United States and Mexico, part in Arizona, part in Sonora, and then he shows the differences in income, quality of public services, levels of security, and respect for the law. And then he says, same people, same geography, but totally different outcomes. As you all know, extractive institutions have prevailed in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Eastern European countries. Critical junctures, however, create a window of opportunity for the creative destruction of the old order and for institutional change. And ending this chapter, constitutional democracy and market economy without concentration of power and without public or private monopolies, are usually the best environment for the flourishing of inclusive institutions. And that ends the first part of our conversation with this important conclusion, which is the relevance of institutions for the prosperity of nations. And from a public law perspective, from a human rights perspective, I think that is a very important statement. We move on to part 2, transformations and afflictions of the 21st century. We live under the aegis of the third industrial revolution, known as the technological revolution or the digital revolution. The two previous revolutions, the first is symbolized by steam in the 18th century, the use of steam, and by the use of electricity in the 19th century as sources of energy. The digital revolution that takes place in the final quarter of the 20th century has allowed for the massification of personal computer, smartphones, and connecting billions of people around the world, the internet. So I think I could say that the worldwide network of computers is the symbol of this third revolution. And in fact, technological breakthroughs have changed the way we conduct the research, the way we do our shopping, the way we book a flight, the way we listen to music. We are living under a new vocabulary and a new semantics, with new terms that we did not know until a week ago, and that now represent utilities without which we would not be able to live. I made a quick list of them. Google, Windows, Mac, WhatsApp, Telegram, which in Brazil has become very dangerous, Uber, Dropbox, Skype, FaceTime, there's no Brazilians in the audience, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Waze, Spotify, Amazon, iTunes, Netflix, and YouTube, just to mention some of them. And for singles, there's also Tinder. The most valuable companies today are no longer, as when I was younger, oil companies like Exxon and Shell, or car makers like General Motors and Ford, or manufacturers of utilities and appliances like General Electric. The most valuable companies today are technology and data companies, such as Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. So innovations and technological advancements build this admirable new world of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, nanotechnology, quantum computing, autonomous cars, and Internet of Things. Algorithm is becoming the most important concept of our time. By now, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution as an unfolding of the digital revolution. And this fourth industrial revolution is the product of the fusion of information technology and biotechnology, integrating the physical and the virtual, the human and the mechanical, and to some extent redefining what it means to be human. In this scenario, just to add one word about law, law is challenged to find answers to problems such as excessive concentration of economic power in few companies, fair taxation of tech giants, and the disappearance of traditional jobs amid many other afflictions of our time. The second topic in this afflictions of the 21st century chapter is the crisis of democracy. As I stated earlier, democracy was the victorious ideology of the 20th century. And it defeated, as I referred before, all alternatives that came by, like communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalism. Lately, however, something seems to be going wrong. A populist and authoritarian wave has swept the world, promoting what some authors have called democratic recession or democratic retrogression. The examples accumulated over the years. Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, Georgia, Ukraine, Philippines, Nicaragua, Venezuela, among others. The novelty that has been pointed out by many authors is that unlike what happened in the past, the erosion of democracy has not come under the guns of military leaders, but it has come through presidents and prime ministers that have been elected by popular vote. And that afterwards, brick by brick, they start deconstructing democracy by concentrating power in the executive, by persecuting leaders of the opposition, by curtailing freedom of the press, by making changes to the constitution with abuse of power by majorities, and packing the courts, among other measures. There are several causes, I think, for the rise of authoritarian populism. I tried to organize them in, of course, 3 categories. Political causes, socio-economic causes, and cultural identity causes. This is the crisis of democracy is the subject of my discussion tomorrow with other colleagues, so I won't go very deeply into this. But the political causes are related to the fact that the political systems, the electoral systems, cannot give these days voice and relevance to citizenship. And the slogan, the motto in many parts of the world in what regards representative politics is, they don't represent us. And besides the problems with the electoral systems all over the world, no one is satisfied with it, with his or her own political system. There is this perception that it's truly the globalized financial and economic power that is really calling the shots these days. The economic, socio-economic causes are associated in some countries like Brazil, for example, with unemployment, and in other countries like the US, with the lack of perspective of social ascent for people that occupy traditional jobs. And the third cause, I'm being very brief and shallow here, is what I call cultural identity causes. There is a relevant contingent of people that do not profess the cosmopolitan, egalitarian, and multicultural creed that drives the progressive agenda, our agenda mostly, of human rights, racial equality, feminist politics, gay marriage, defense of indigenous people, environmental protection, and the drug decriminalization, just to mention some important modern social movements, some modernities, as I like to call. As I said, I won't go very deep into this. before ending this topic, I would just like to make two final remarks. First, one should not ignore the Chinese factor, which is an authoritarian alternative regime tainted by corruption, but of vertiginous economic and social success, and the temptation that it might represent for many countries in the world. And two, one should not rule out the hypothesis that this is only a moment of a certain bitterness of progressive thinking due to the current prevalence of conservative ideas in many parts of the world. But this is democracy. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. So I just want to make sure, and I think this is an important point for a democratic perspective. One thing is this wave of conservatism that many people are unhappy. One other thing is the populist authoritarian wave. Sometimes they come together, but these are different things. Being conservative doesn't mean necessarily being authoritarian. So in this scenario, law is being summoned to rethink structures that have aged and institutional designs that were conceived for another era. And third and last topic in the second chapter is climate change or global warming. I struggled with this terminology, climate change or global warming. The original title was global warming, and I was happy with it. And then I read in the NASA site that climate change is the more proper expression. So I wouldn't argue with NASA, so I changed the title of my paper. Climate change has been identified as the most important environmental issue of the 21st century and one of the defining issues of our time. Numerous authors have referred to it as the tragedy of the commons, an expression that many of you probably have heard of, which describes a situation in which individuals acting with attention only to self-interest behave in a way that's contrary to the common good in the use of scarce resources. There are two features of the climate debate that make it harder to get proper action to be taken. First one is that despite the fact that the most part of the scientists assure us that there is a problem with climate change and it's human activity that's causing the problem, there is still a lot of ignorance and skepticism about climate change. That's the first problem. The second one is the fact that the emissions that are made today, carbon emissions that are made today, will only produce effects in 1 or 2 generations, in 25 or 50 years. And that has worked as an incentive to postpone the decisions and solutions that are rather urgent. The central concept here is still sustainable development, which has long been understood as the development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the possibility of the next generations to meet their own needs. Global warming is associated with greenhouse effect. I won't take the time to describe what's greenhouse effect. I can do it in the debates if anyone is interested. When I wrote the paper, I think this is so important that I made sure that people would know what that is. And the consequences of global warming, of the climate change, actually, are the following. Global warming, ocean warming, ice sheet melting in Greenland and Antarctica, glacial retreat, the loss of snow cover in the northern hemisphere, sea level rise, loss in the extent and thickness of the Arctic sea ice, species extinction, and an increasing number of extreme weather conditions like heat waves, floods, and hurricanes. The more recent being Dorian, that hit and devastated Bahamas, as you probably read in the papers. So the major challenge here for lawyers and for everyone, I would say, is that the major challenge is that in this area is the need for transnational solutions involving the cooperation of all countries. This is because factors that affect the environment and climate on Earth, they produce consequences that do not respect borders. And here we come to our final part, third part. This superstition I have about classifying everything in the three parts. I don't have the time to explain why I have it, but I like to say in my defense that Niels Bohr, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, he had at the door of his office a horseshoe. And one day, a journalist asked him why a man like him, an agnostic, a scientist, why would he have a horseshoe by the door of his office? And he said, well, I heard that it brings good luck even for those who don't believe in it. So I'm in this creed. Part 3 of our conversation, and last part before the conclusion, is the challenges of our time, limits and possibilities of the law, some risks of the technological revolution. The digital revolution and the developments that announce the fourth industrial revolution, they bring the allure of modern life with its promises of longevity and new comforts. But with them also comes inconveniences, threats, and risks, and challenges to law in different areas of knowledge. Here are 3 of these challenges. How to deal with freedom of expression on the internet, in situations like hate speech, disinformation or malinformation campaigns, the so-called fake news, and this horrible, dangerous thing, which is deep fake. This is going to change the way we communicate. Secondly, and moving to the bioethics domain, many countries have regulated embryonic stem cell research. Most countries, all countries I think, prohibit human cloning. All countries prohibit commerce of human organs, although there is organ trafficking in many parts of the world, in some parts of the world. That's a horrible thing. And there is a field of medicine called regenerative medicine, whose purpose is to produce human organs. So we might be living sometime in the future in a world where human organs can be bought and sold. And finally, genetic engineering, which is the subject that Matthias was mentioning at the beginning. Most scientists, although they don't endorse it, they consider that it's going to be inevitable, that genetic engineering will come, especially because it has the capacity of healing, of facing many genetic diseases that still kill a lot of people. The problem is, of course, eugeny is always a ghost, but more than that, there's the fear that through genetic engineering, men won't resist the temptation of creating supermen. People that are, women that are prettier, or men that are more handsome, stronger, brighter, and the risks that represent to the human condition as it is today, and to the increase of inequality in the world. And still in this chapter of risks of the technological revolution. We spoke about disinformation campaigns, genetic engineering, and the risks for privacy has called the attention of legislators all over the world, as you probably know. And in what regards privacy, there are two different situations. First, the access that tech companies have to personal data of all of us. They know my name, they know my job, they know my wife's name, they know how much money I owe, they know my tax returns go through the system, and more than that, and that's the second situation, they know my interests, my preferences, just by monitoring my navigation online. So privacy has become, or the end of privacy has also become one of the defining issues of our time. There's, in Europe, they have recently approved the General Data Protection Regulation. In the US, there's no national law on that. California has its own law. In Brazil, a privacy protection law was passed and will become effective in 2020. Brazil is the fourth country in number of users of the internet, 181 million users. The fact is, the power will be with whoever controls the data. That's why it has become so important. Second chapter, or second topic in this final chapter is democracy and its internal enemies. Some factors threaten contemporary democracies. Three of them are the decline in support for democracy, inequality, and corruption. Starting with the decline in support for democracy, surveys all over the world have demonstrated that young generations don't care as much as we do, or many of us do, about preserving democratic institutions. And of course, that is a major problem, and I think legal scholars and political scientists and human rights advocates will have to invest time and energy in the search for an institutional design capable of reviving democratic institutions and of mobilizing citizenships. The separation of powers doctrine has become obsolete. The electoral systems have become obsolete. And the internet, that at one point generated the expectations that it could help us create this comprehensive digital public sphere, like a Habermasian public sphere, so far has not delivered this promise, and just the opposite. In many situations, the internet has produced what we call tribalization or deliberative enclaves, which are groups with strong and often radical views that talk only to themselves. And besides that, the disinformation campaigns and hate speech, as I mentioned. There are some positive experiences, very located positive experiences with the internet or digital democracy. It's happened in Chile and in Iceland. But unfortunately, the bad news of the internet is still haunting us. The second factor that I think compromises democracy is inequality and poverty, which are dramatic marks of our time. That's the unfinished agenda of civilization. There are several factors that affect that subject. I won't have much time to discuss this. Some countries have created this concept of existential minimum or vital minimum. Many countries have social rights in their constitutions. Enforcing them is a drama for all constitutional courts all over the world. There's no magic solution for that, but like the universal recipe includes quality education, efficient public services, and inclusive economic and political institutions. And finally, corruption also compromises dramatically democracies, and it has economic costs, social costs, and moral costs. It's interesting because corruption has been with humanity since the beginning, but it was only in the last decades, I'd say, or probably the last decade of the 20th century, that this really became an issue, and you started to have domestic legislation and especially international legislation. There are three main treaties dealing with corruption. My time is running out, so I won't detail those. We can discuss about it. And finally, the efforts against global warming. There's no doubt these days that global warming stems from human activities. This is a global phenomenon, as I said, that needs solutions to be sought in international, regional, and national levels. The UN regime to address climate change rests on three pillars, three main treaties. The Framework Convention from 1994, the Kyoto Protocol from 1997, and the Paris Agreement from 2016. They are all concerned with limiting the emissions of carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas responsible for the global warming. And living in Brazil, I should, of course, add the destruction of forests as one of the most dramatic chapters in the environmental risks we are dealing with here. In the Amazon, for example, in the last 40 years, more than 2 Germanys, the area corresponding to more than 2 Germanys, were deforested. And so if we continue at the current levels of destruction, the tropical rainforest will disappear in around 100 years. There are many causes for that. Ignorance and skepticism are 2 of them. And the forests, they account for approximately 1/4 of the climate mitigation under the Paris Agreement because of the photosynthesis that retain the carbon. So when you destroy a forest, you destroy this mechanism that retains carbon, and besides, when you destroy it, you liberate back the carbon that was kept in the forest. There will be an evaluation of the results of the Paris Agreement in 2023, and there's little doubt that much broader efforts will need to be made to achieve any relevant goals. This is not easy. International law, as you all know, have problems in its enforcement, but we are dealing here with a question of intergenerational justice in order not to leave a degraded planet to posterity. There are authors in that series that are now speculating about the need to colonize space in the search for new habitats because of what is being done to Mother Earth. So we come to our conclusion. As we have seen throughout this presentation, law has in its agenda the arduous task of 1. Neutralizing the negative side effects of the digital revolution and its unfoldings. 2. Restoring the trust in democratic institutions and overcoming dysfunctions such as inequality and corruption. And 3. Effectively addressing the phenomenon of climate change before it is too late. The unsurmountable truth is that the speed, extent, and depth of the transformations, the changes in the contemporary world test laws, limits, and possibilities. Even the near future is unpredictable. There are no prearranged roadmaps, and underlying the ideas of this presentation are the following goals that I think should motivate and inspire us in facing all these afflictions I just mentioned, which are, first, the survival of humanity. Climate dystopia would destroy life on Earth. Second, peace among nations. A nuclear war would represent or could represent the end of the human condition. 3, preservation of democracy, proper sovereignty, freedom, equality, and rule of law are some of the greatest achievements of civilization. 4, sustainable development. Preservation and renewal of resources is a matter of intergenerational justice. 5, seeking equal opportunities for people and nations. People and nations should be free, equal, and have access to the products of progress. And 6, social protection nets for less fortunate people and aid mechanisms for countries that have fallen behind. And I say solidarity with people and countries is a moral duty of all. Finally, in a world where defeating death and colonizing space are issues already under serious discussion, the only safe compass is the perennial values shared since ancient times, among which are good, justice, and respect for others, as cornerstones of the emancipation of people and the protection of human dignity. I am well aware that all these ideas, good, justice, respect for others, emancipation, and human dignity, are abstract, vague, and open concepts. But it is the meaning that countries, political leaders, and citizens give to them that will define the world in which we will be living in. Thank you.
Would you like to field your own questions?
Sure.
The floor is open.